today at a forum I've been anxious and excited about for the last couple of months. For those of you whom I don't know, I'm Steve Clemens. I direct the American Strategy Program at the New America Foundation. We have lots of distinguished folks here today. I want to say a particular hello to my boss, Steve Cole, who's president of New America, and of course, a well-known Pulitzer Prize-winning author, most recently of the Bin Ladens and a writer for The New Yorker, and Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, former Chief of Staff of the State Department, in the back of the room. My old friend Wayne Glass, who has 13 students here from the University of Southern California, and we'll get into that later. It's good to have you with. And we have quite a number of folks watching on various blog sites a live discussion that we're hoping to have today with Tom Fingar. Thomas Fingar is chairman of the National Intelligence Council and deputy director of National Intelligence for Analysis, and has held that role since 2005. And he's done lots of other stuff in government. And let me share with you, to my knowledge, I have never met Tom before. I've been spamming him for years on an email address that I suspect every once in a while he would take a look at. And I have a number of friends I'm privileged to have in the intelligence, national security community, all of whom have said that people who handle the sort of the culture, the flow of national security and often covert intelligence, trying to package this, analyze it, put it together in a process, that there's no one better than Tom Fingar in this regard. And trying to, as well, deal with some of the introspective need to look self-critically at the intelligence community's role and function in the past has also been part of Tom Fingar's job and responsibility recently, in terms of how to shake up cultures. Every culture has to shake up culture. The New America Foundation has to shake itself up every once in a while, and Tom Fingar is doing that. And on the periphery, I've been participating in an open source initiative in which the intelligence community has been interacting more with those beyond the fortress of intelligence out in the real world. And that's been an interesting experiment that Tom Fingar has launched. I mentioned USC earlier because at the other part of California, in Northern California, Tom was well known as a leading China scholar and thinker and a non-proliferation scholar at Stanford University. And he is known for his work on China, Germany, non-proliferation. Of course, I did a similar background, but I was down at UCLA and with the Southerners. But we had our own rivalry with USC going on at the time. But the reason that I approached Tom Fingar's staff 2 months ago was we'd already seen the product of the National Intelligence Estimate on Iran come out, and it was applause. It received applause in some quarters and criticism in others. What I found interesting about the criticism is that some of the criticism dealt with the personalities of drafters and writers. Shortly after that, a National Intelligence Estimate came out on Iraq that fundamentally parts of the analysis looked at some of the positive impact of the role of the surge. And the critics on that were, I would say, more on the political left. And when you saw different sides of the political spectrum critiquing a process and almost in the media, in my view, treating as if this were sort of a casual process. And from my own experience and whatnot, I didn't think that was to be true, but I hadn't heard an explication and a discussion of how the National Intelligence Estimate process really works. What goes into it? What are the tests? How do you deal with all that? So I asked National Intelligence Council Chairman Fingar to share with us exactly what goes into the process and to think less about this estimate versus that estimate versus the controversies and more about analytics, structure, and approach. And I'm very much looking forward to that. And after that, we'll have a Q&A discussion. This is all on the record for those of you that are here, as it's airing on the web. There's nothing we can do about that. And I want to thank, please give a round of applause and help me welcome Tom Fingar.
Thank you, Steve. Steve Cole, thank you for the invitation to speak to this group. It's a delight to recognize some friends in the audience. What I'm going to try and do today is to describe and demystify the NIE process. There's an awful lot of misunderstanding, mischaracterization, I think a lot of it willful, some of it probably inadvertent. And I'm going to do it at the level of generic estimates rather than talk about specific examples. In question time, happy to deal with specifics. The first point I guess I'd like to make by way of introduction is that an estimate and its companion, a national intelligence assessment, I'll explain the difference later, should be thought of as much as a process as a product. It is in some ways the culmination of work being done over a period of time in a variety of places that sort of reaches a critical mass. So we ought to take stock of this, see what we think, how it fits together, as well as a product, which is the coordinated, at least aggregated thinking of the intelligence community on a subject at a particular point in time. And it is estimative. It means by the very nature of it, it's pressing the envelope. It's reaching beyond what is known. We have very little reporting from the future. We're attempting to project where events are headed, what the trajectories are, what the trend lines are, where there may be inflection points, how you would know if you'd seen one of those inflection points, where there might be opportunities to intercede, intervene, and change the course of events from the direction that is headed should one wish to do so. And in that sense, it's not sort of a retrospective. What is our best assessment of the reason things happened in the past, now that we have some amount of historical data available? Is taking data, much of which is historic. It may be historic in a matter of days or weeks. It may be impressionistic about where people think a decision train is going to go. But to take it and say, how do we understand this situation, whatever it is, to articulate that understanding, the basis for the understanding, and then to project forward on some previously determined lines of investigation. I say it is a process because there is a bringing together of analysts from across the community. There are 16 agencies in the intelligence community. There are more analytic centers than that. One counts things like the National Intelligence Council or the Open Source Center, which have analysts and contribute but are not counted in the 16. To bring people together, same room, same set of questions. There's networking, there are side conversations, there are let's standardize the terminology we are using to refer to events, to explicitly compare and contrast judgments made by different people in different places at different times and see if they truly are different or they just are describing a different part of the elephant on a different day. And then there is the moving forward. It's a new sort of basis for assessing the accuracy, or at least the utility of our analytic judgments as events play out over time. Timelines of estimates are normally in the 2 to 5 year range. So you actually begin to get feedback. And if we're not making calls, we're not doing our job, which means you could be wrong. If we're making safe calls, we're not very useful. If we're making safe calls, we're probably describing something that anybody would have projected to be the case. What I'm going to do in the next few moments is begin with the important beginning, which is the infamous Iraq WMD estimate, which made the NIE both a symbol and a vehicle for transforming analysis within the intelligence community. I'm going to lay out some of the elements of that transformation, important parts of which were directed by Nancy Tucker, who's sitting in the audience, and then sort of walk through the process of producing an estimate. Why do I start with the Iraq WMD estimate? Badly flawed. Probably studied more closely by more people over a longer period of time than anything else that the community has produced. My perspective on this is an insider. as I'm critical of it, I was one of the members of the National Foreign Intelligence Board that signed off on this. INR, where I was working at the time, dissented on a portion of it, but this is sort of the, I know how bad it was because I am personally responsible for some of that. It's not criticizing the bad work done by others. This is significant because on the current National Intelligence Board, which replaced there are three of us who are at the table: Mike Hayden, director of the CIA, and Jim Clapper, who is the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. We were all there. So there's a personal dimension to this of our reputation will be served to the extent that we can make the process better than the one that produced the flawed estimate. But it's far more important because it opened the door. The bad estimate used or misused in policy debate that became the tipping point counterbalance, if that's the right way to do it, between the 9/11 Commission calling for change in the community and an impetus to move beyond yet another study that went into the file cabinet. It legislated ways in which we could change a community that's been in place for almost 60 years. It also helped identify starting point problems. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't interject at this point that as bad as that estimate was, the intelligence community, the analytic community got a bad rap. A tiny percentage of analysts working a tiny sliver of the issues was involved in this estimate. And most of those involved in this estimate had only a small part. This was produced in 2 weeks. You don't produce much original thinking in 2 weeks. I'll come back to that. But the entire analytic community got tarred with the brush of being inept, politicized, or worse. The situation never was as bad as depicted, not by a long shot. So my sort of challenge here in some respects was not as hard as some people thought it would be. I had to take a flawed operation that was deficient in certain easy-to-identify respects and make it better. My colleagues and counterparts around the intelligence community, the analytic community, had the same understanding of the situation and determination to do it. So this wasn't a drag people kicking and screaming to make changes that they didn't want to undertake. What followed from the politicization and the publicity around that estimate with the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004 created both an imperative and an opportunity to, in quote, fix analysis, a big portion of which, in my view, was to restore confidence in the work done by the analytic community, restore confidence in analytic organizations, in analysts, and to restore confidence of analysts in themselves. This broad brush tarring, it hit morale, and we had to work on that. Let me shift to some of the lessons that were learned out of the exemplary bad estimate. We could have drawn similar lessons from other products, but they were crystallized because this one was so problematic. One was, and a very key one, that analysts knew too little about sourcing, that the information that we were using was kept behind a screen, that the collectors protected tightly information about what was being reported. Probably the most famous of this is the curveball example on BW, but it could be generalized. And one of the first of the changes that was made by George Tenet, that the lessons were being learned and transformation began before OD&I came into existence. And that was to give a small number of analysts much greater insight into the sourcing. Over time, we have expanded the number, expanded the degree of transparency, that you have to know what you're working with here. I have 7 reports on a topic. Well, did they come from one guy 7 times? 7 people one time each? How many of them are ours, and how many of them are of another countries that were shared with us? Can you get back and ask more questions of this individual? That kind of standard things that journalists would do and academics would do. Analysts are now able to do a much higher degree with collectors. Second, that, and again, the Iraq WMD just took it to the logical extreme, reliance on work that had been done previously. Estimate of products, analytic products, collection products, judgments that had been reached months or years previously, sort of taken almost as a sacred text starting point, and too little effort to go back and re-examine the sourcing, the premises, the judgments, lessons learned, perspective over time. I say it was really crystallized in this bad estimate because it was produced in 2 weeks. That's mostly grab stuff off the shelf, not a lot of time to reconsider, but that there's an enormous cost to doing that. Lesson was clearly learned. And the need to go back. Now if it is an estimate, is go back to square one. Each time we do one of these, is to re-examine the old evidence to see if it stands up, re-examine to see if it leads us to the same conclusions, re-examine it in light of subsequently acquired information, re-examine the judgments, consider alternative explanations much more rigorously. A third is that we'd had inadequate attention to analytic tradecraft, basic analytic methodologies. We could wrap it all up in intelligence community jargon, but basically it was sort of the rules for the use of evidence and inference for producing work that was reproducible. Somebody else know what sources were used, know what assumptions were factored into the equation, and could sort of check the homework. A particular pathological element of that Iraq WMD was blurring and mixing between analytical work, which I would characterize as taking the facts, or at least the information, and say, how can I make sense of these? Where do they lead me? What's the interpretation or the multiple interpretations one can make of this pile of facts? Not preparation of a legal brief. Make the case that Saddam is evil. Make the case that Saddam has WMD, which is very different. If you're driving to a bottom line and fitting the evidence to a predetermined conclusion, and that we're not in the business of reaching predetermined conclusions. That this ought to be, where does the evidence lead the argument? And the final one I'll mention here is excessive emphasis on consensus. That the convention and the jargon was dissenting opinions could be expressed in a footnote. Most of the time, footnote was literally a note at the bottom of the page that would say something like, the Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of Intelligence and Research disagrees with this, sometimes because in a couple of words worth, but that sort of lock people in a room until they would reach agreement, which drove towards lowest common denominator consensus. It had other maladies associated, deferring to organizations based on size or how vocal an individual was at the table, but that we needed alternative analysis. We needed to consider the facts in multiple lights, and more importantly, if we gave all analysts access to the same information and they came to different conclusions applying good tradecraft, that was important. That the message to be sort of, dear sir or madam, decision maker, you need to know that despite the expenditure of billions of dollars and the best efforts of hundreds of analysts, this is unclear. So the ice under any decision you make is going to be thin. that you need to be aware of that, not overstating what we know, and not just saying, most people think this and some others think that. But if it's a credible argument, they're presented equally, prominently, and said, we can't decide. We're giving you our best shot on both dimensions, which seldom is more than two as a matter of empirical deduction, empirical discovery. The adoption of standards, this is what Nancy was involved in leading. In fact, I will give Steve some cards, and he can make them available to folks. We give these to every analyst. It has standards to be judged on, and I'll just hit them very briefly going past here. Sourcing. You got to understand and describe the nature of the information you're using. You got to explicitly express the confidence you have in the information and in the confidence level of your judgments, which means you have to think about it. You have to just...
Here, by the way, is so that you can share it.
Yeah, yeah. You can go on a website and get these. The distinction between evidence and assumption. The very nature of our business is we're playing with a deck with a whole lot less than 52 cards in it. That closing the information gaps with explicit assumptions. So you can compare judgments that maybe the evidence is the same, but a different assumption was used to close the gap, and making that explicit. Has to be relevant to U.S. foreign policy. We're not writing this just for our own entertainment. It has to be logical. You have to be able to follow the logic chain. A, B, C, therefore D, not A, C, M, therefore Q, explained by, well, we have gaps in our information. You should have gaps in your logic in getting the point across. Your arguments either have to be consistent, the body of work feeding into this with others, or you have to explain why it's not simply a reiteration of the last time you looked at this problem. That led you to the same conclusion and you're updating it. If there's a step function kind of difference, why? You need to make that clear to people. And finally, accuracy. Accuracy, departing from the estimate here, is a troubling aspect to me. That my guesstimate for intelligence community products is we're probably right 85% of the time. That bothers me. I'd be much happier if we were right 350, 35% of the time, bat 350. Why would you want to be wrong all that many times? It's because we're right in part because we're answering questions that are too damn easy. So inflating the batting average with a lot of bunt singles is not why we're paid to do the job. It's to press that envelope. It's to deal with the really hard questions. It's to be really hard-nosed about whether we were right or we were wrong, not on the one hand, on the other hand, so caveated that a decision maker doesn't know what they've got from us. So getting the community to focus on really important, really hard question and making tough calls inevitably will make us wrong more often. I don't desire to be wrong, but we will be. But those products that we predict, the judgments we make, the calls we make, we ought to take a look at it. Were we right or wrong? Were we right for the right reasons? Because the evidence good, the logic was tight, the tradecraft was good? Or do we have all of that screwed up and we made a lucky guess? And we ought to be honest with ourselves on this. And the same for when we're wrong. Short note here, we've improved procedures a lot. We've incorporated into training evaluation of products across the community to the same standards. By the end of the year, every one of the agencies will have an in-house evaluation program evaluating their own products against common standards. We raised consciousness of the need to be aware, the little gimmick of this goes on people's lanyards and can hang around their neck, to be aware that supervisors being aware that their products are going to be evaluated against these standards by outside folks within the ODNI. The determination to get it right, the professionalism of the IC analytic community really should not be shortchanged or underestimated. People are serious about what they do. This is not a lark. They know it has consequences, that the United States government might do or refraining from doing things because of what we say. So the desire to do a good job is very high. I think we have raised confidence and self-confidence in our ability to do a good job. Now let me segue into the production of an NIE, which builds upon and incorporates some of these, as well as rehearses some time-honored ways of tackling hard estimative questions. What's the genesis of an NIE? Where does it come from? Sometimes a policymaker, a military commander will ask for it. Well, we're looking at making some important decisions 6, 8, 9 months down the road. We'd like your best judgment about the nature of the problem and where the opportunities are, where the pitfalls are. Often it's an NIO initiative, National Intelligence Officer, for regional and functional questions, who are familiar with sort of the state of play in the community. Who's written what, who's working on what. They're familiar with the discussions and deliberations in deputies committee meetings, undersecretary or deputy secretary level meetings, or principals committees, cabinet level discussions, because we attend them. The National Intelligence Officers will attend these. What is it that they need to know, even if they haven't asked for it? But just saying, what are obvious questions for which the intelligence community might be able to develop some information and generate some insight? And sometimes it comes out of peer discussions within the community and policymakers, and saying, haven't updated that for a while. Or there was a report in the news. Does that suggest that something's different? And we'll go back, and it may start out as a different kind of product, and as we work on it, say, no, let's make this into a full-blown estimate. One of the first steps is to set the terms of reference. Convoluted title for saying, get the question right. What is the primary question we want to address? And then what are the secondary questions? To bound this thing, we're not doing the history of the universe part 2. That what is it exactly that we think will give us the highest degree of understanding, the greatest insight into the problem, is most consistent with the requirements that were posed for us by whoever requested the estimate. That we do these sometimes by convening a small group of knowledgeable people from inside and outside of the community, inside out, to talk about it, shape it. Sometimes we'll prepare a straw man, bring the group together, refine it. It then will go to be peer reviewed by the National Intelligence Council, the NIOs. And the peer review is serious, because you get as good as you give. If you take the work of your colleagues seriously, they will do the same for you. And here's where you get, well, we think we had a similar subject in my area. Well, I worked on this. Have you thought about? And it just will get molded in the, what are the questions we want to answer? The next day is to select people to draft it. Contrary to the impression conveyed in some of the op-ed stuff that was written after the Iran nuclear estimate, it suggests that I dashed this off as an op-ed one evening. The NIO will pick drafters based on knowledge of who in the community is best able to work that problem. We want a good first draft. So you go to knowledgeable people. We don't care where they are. They're at DIA, they're in CIA, they're in INR. They might be in another part of the community, might be a treasury if it's an economic issue. Parse the questions out to different people. Sometimes an NIO or a deputy will do a portion of this. But the basic premise is get it to the person who knows the most about the subject so that they can prepare the draft. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes, we'll convene a group of analysts from across the community before we start drafting. Let's brainstorm. Let's talk about this. Let's see if this set of questions and in terms of reference actually leads us in the direction we want to go. As well as or if you're going to write on that, make sure you consider this body of information, that outside expert you might go to. So there's a sort of putting our heads together and sharing insights before the drafters go off to go to work. As they go off, part of the charge is you go all the way back to the beginning. You can look at, and you ought to look at, what the community has written previously, what relevant outside, but question the evidence, double-check the evidence, question the judgments and the assumptions, make them explicit. Part of this now is working in partnership with the collection folks, people who pull things out of the air and take pictures from the sky, and spies of the more conventional type. As they see what information we are using, there is an iterative process here. Revalidate this. Tell us, do you know something more about this source? Any reason we ought to be suspicious of this? Any hesitation in us using it? Is there other information that you're aware of that you can give to us that we haven't discovered yet in this? So it's an iterative process that minimizes the danger of products that are flawed at the end because they've got bad information in them from the beginning. A draft or drafts or partial drafts are produced by the 2, 3, 5, however many drafters there are in this exercise. Comes into the National Intelligence Officer, who individually or with the staff sort of combines it, massages it, plays with the order to have it make sense, begins to identify gaps. What are the logic steps that have been skipped, or information and argumentation that needs to be built in to give it coherence? When they think they've got something that's serviceable, they take it back to the peers. The NIOs convene again. NIOs deputies, it's a floating crap game as to who's there. And they'll critique it pretty seriously. I can't follow this logic. That's opaque as hell. Everybody knows that. Why would we expend any time in ink? Everybody knows that China has a large population. We don't need to spend a lot of time on that. And sort of more serious, kind of obvious deficiencies that got built in there because in the construction process it seemed useful to note. After the peer review, the NIO will go back and revise it again. Sometimes we'll commission new drafting. Sometimes we'll send a piece of it back to the drafter to work on it. It then gets back, polished, and we're ready for formal coordination, almost. Now is when it comes to me or the vice chairman of the NIC or one of the other senior people who begin to look at it, usually seriously for the first time, reading it as generalists, as people well aware of the tradecraft requirements, and begin to go through. And not many of these escape without significant suggestions for additional work or clarification or moving it around. Then we send it out to the agencies. They get to see the whole package. The list of the sources used is with them, so they can go check. Whoever's representing the agency at the table, maybe 1, maybe 2, 3, 5 people. There's no hard and fast rule. They work within their individual agencies, and they come back. First with written comments or emailed stuff in. You missed this, that's wrong, I disagree. We're going to come in with an alternative argument. Here's what it's going to look like. And then we will convene people for what are formally called coordination sessions. Most analysts would refer to them as struggle sessions, term coming out of Chinese Communist Party history, where people will argue over the utility of specific assumptions, whether the evidence has been properly assembled, whether alternative judgments and interpretations have been adequately considered, clarifying, sharpening what's being said. Some of the disagreements go away when you realize it's just, well, terminology was wrong, or, oh, that's a better assumption to close it. Sometimes, on portions of it, there will be true alternative judgments, and they will be articulated as at whatever length is necessary to make it clear to a reader. Once that process is gone through, it's revised again. It goes back to me. It goes to the editing staff, publishing staff, to polish this thing up. And then we send it out to the NIB principals, the National Intelligence Board, the heads of the analytic components of the community. General Hayden, General Alexander, Admiral Moret, Randy Fort, Assistant Secretary in INR, Assistant Secretary Janice Gardner from Treasury, and so forth. That they get it, they review it, they argue it out with their staffs so that they understand it and they're willing to stand behind it, or they want to make some changes. Their suggestions and comments are forwarded in. At this point, it's beginning to move with much greater rapidity. While it goes out to principals, we will brief it to the Director of National Intelligence and/or the Principal Deputy. I shift from my NIC chair hat to my Deputy Director for Analysis hat and sit on the side of the table that takes the brief and gets critiqued and critiques it here, so that the principals understand where we're going. Mike McConnell often has sort of question, views, comments, suggestions, or things to be changed. We then, usually within a matter of a day or two, convene the National Intelligence Board, where the discussion is really quite serious. I mean, it's really gratifyingly serious. Having sat through years of a much more pro forma process, people are engaged, and they're not arguing about happies to glad and where the comma belongs. It has to do with, is that the most effective way to present the argument? Should we move this around in order to highlight that? There's a discussion and modifications to it. Hopefully it'll be approved at this session, or approved with changes. Sometimes the changes are sufficiently significant that we'll circulate them around for people to take another look at. One of the people who attends the session is the analytic ombudsman, responsible for analytic integrity, any signs of politicization. Just observes the discussion. Is anybody bringing up things like Congress won't like that very much? We ought to change it because it'll make the president unhappy. Mercifully, that kind of thing doesn't happen, but we've got somebody there to blow the whistle if it appears to be going in that direction. Once the changes are in there, we print it. Printing is a big deal. You send it to a print plant, it costs a lot of money, it's there. And then we brief it to the president. It's printed when we take it to the president. So what we've got is locked in there. That by courtesy, we brief the president, cabinet members, and then we disseminate it, usually within hours of that briefing. Disseminate to policymakers, military commands, to the Congress. After that, a revised version, or revised versions, if it's been approved by the National Intelligence Board, maybe for particular allies or partners, might go to NATO, might go to another grouping, and we provide that to them. We offer briefings on the Hill, policymakers around, and then finally it gets posted on electronic sites. And bring this to a close by saying this process can take anywhere from a few months to more than a year. And one of the things that makes the long ones long is the continual infusion of new information. The Iran nuclear estimate was done in June of last year. I read off on the penultimate text, ready to send us in for, make Fingar's editorial changes and we'll move this thing out. And we got new information, significant new information. Got to look at it. And
After
then,
June '07.
after June '07. And it was, why would we publish something that we know we're going to have to take another look? And it took a long time to look at the information. And then a lot more information began to come in. And to work our way through. And it wasn't just look at the new information. It was go back and look at all the old information in light of the new information. Where it suggested there was change, well, was the new one better than the old one, or was the old one better than the new one? Why? That kind of thing, it's rigorous. It takes time to do it. These things have not yet reached the stage of ultimate perfection. They are inherently unsatisfactory to some of the people we give them to because, again, going back to that Iraq WMD estimate, NIEs have become kind of a talisman, a token, symbol, totem here, as well as a political stick to whack partisan opponents. And that's actually kind of a new departure. I've been in the community now for 38 years, done a lot of estimates in that time. The public dimension, the politicized dimension is new in my experience. It may have been back there in the 60s during Vietnam, but I don't recall reading about that. Working out of the limelight, working so that analysts aren't metaphorically looking over their shoulder. See, how are my words going to be depicted? Our words going to be spun in the public? Is an important consideration. If we're going to be as objective as we can, if we're going to make judgments wherever the information leads us, and whether it makes some people happy or other people mad shouldn't be a consideration. It's our best shot at answering a hard question. I hope that I'll say all, probably will have to default to most, estimates stay classified. And I'll bring this to a close. Even when we have released unclassified versions of the key judgment, it's a lot like the dust jacket on a book. That the Iran nuclear was 140 pages long, with almost 1,500 source notes at the end of it. It was boiled down to 3.5 pages. I don't think I have to try very hard to persuade you that important nuance probably was wrung out in this. And it got, as Steve indicated, a lot of attention, as have some others, and criticism. But nobody who's actually read the whole product, to my knowledge, has challenged the judgments we reached on the basis of the evidence we presented. Let me stop that and invite questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you. I'm going to pose a question here at the beginning, but I want to say that when I open up the floor, we do have quite a number of people watching this live on the New America Foundation website, the Washington Note, and so I want to thank all of them, and if you could acknowledge who you are when you pose questions. But let me ask Tom one question. When our boss, Steve Cole, just went out, this would be a good story. When New America Foundation was a tiny outfit, Eric Schmidt, who's now the CEO of Google, was then the CEO of Novell, was on our board, and he basically said, you know, if Ted Halstead and Steve Clemens don't piss me off once a quarter, I'm going to fire them. In other words, the notion was our board was sending us a signal, take risks, go out of the box, and that means you're going to flop and fail sometime. And I think what the 2007 Iraq NIE did, which was so shocking, is that we had grown used to some degree in the political culture we are in, of everyone just sort of falling together. And my question, when I watched President Bush, and I've watched it many times over again, it's very clear he read that long report. And even if he might think the world is changing, he stood solidly with the report and the findings of the report. But how is the debate now about your role and the role of the intelligence community and sometimes doing and saying things that the bosses don't like? What are the penalties, or have the concern about penalties dissipated?
It's a good question. It basically is how politicized is the process. Let me come at it in three directions. The first is, I've never thought or experienced the process as being highly politicized. I mean, it's it's been around a long time, and if decision makers wanted cheerleaders, they'd hire the Redskinettes. That if we're going to be useful at all, we have to have the latitude to say things that might not square well with decisions made previously, their policy preferences. The second is, it's not our job to make people happy. It's our job to inform decisions. That decision makers, by definition, can make whatever decision they think is appropriate. Whether it's a policeman, a military commander, a foreign policy, economic decision maker. They're factoring in considerations in addition to what we tell them, and they should be. They should be. We're a part of the story. The final observation here is in my time in Washington, I've learned that there are only two possibilities. There are policy successes and intelligence failures. You've never seen the opposite, where the intel guys had it absolutely right and the policy people screwed it up. Doesn't work that way. Grow up, get used to it. And that kind of criticism, I don't think, bothers the analytical community.
Great, thank you. Let me open the floor here, and I'm going to have to repeat your question, and I will probably only do a nugget of your excellent question. Let me start with Harlan Ullman, and if you can make them as brief as possible because there's so many questions out there.
Two related questions. One, what do you think caused the NIE process to become so atrophied that required to be fixed?
So one is, what caused the NIE process to become atrophied?
And second, when it comes to big, important estimates like this, do you think the DNA in our political system is such that inherently you're going to follow the way the president wants to go? I mean, you can go back 50 years, and you can see on very big issues, we tended to miss the big points, not because necessarily the analytical community was wrong, but because the administration wanted something in a certain way done.
Does the DNA of our political system essentially mean that what the president outlines as preferences become reflected in the report, and big issues?
Yeah, well, let me segue from my last comment about we provide input and others make decisions. That the diplomatic historians in the office, I think, can speak to somebody who's an amateur in that field. That administrations, and it may be DNA, it's not one or another, it's all of them, since the intelligence community has existed, have made decisions congruent with goals that they've set, perceptions of the world, and the intelligence input. It may tweak that, it may provide some tactical guidance, but on big strategic direction, we don't do much that has a big impact. Indeed, one of the reasons I suspect that the legislation mandated creation of a long-range analytic unit to push it out there to at least have some more explicit alternatives. So we didn't aim at that, and it was sort of that's hard to change, says history on it. Why did it become so atrophied? First, I don't think it was. I mean, again, the process was not as bad as the bad illustrative example. But it had evolved in a way that the gestation period had become so long on all of these things because of the lower priority given to them. It was assigned to who is an expendable analyst, not who's the best, but who can I spare to go disappear for many months to do this. So you got bad drafts that nobody wanted to polish, and senior people not putting the time into them that they should be putting into them. And I don't know, part of it is just the nature of, you got to shake things up once in a while. The point Steve made at the beginning, even though it was mostly working reasonably well, it was failing to make adjustments because the Cold War had ended, because the need and the ability to rely on expertise outside of the intelligence community, where most of the information wasn't secrets anymore, that it needed to be factored in. The questions that we were being asked weren't dependent on covertly acquired information. It really was dependent on insight from smart people.
Right. Jonathan Landay with McClatchy Newspapers. I want to ask about the reforms that you instituted post 2000 WMD NIE on Iraq. When you hear a policymaker say things that doesn't square with the analysis and the intelligence, is there a mechanism now whereby you can go to them and say, stop saying that because it's not true? And let me, and in that regard, when you hear someone, senior, talk about a tactical defeat of a leading terrorist group, I'd like to know what a tactical defeat is, and if that isn't what happened, do you then go back to them and say, you're not reflecting accurately what the intelligence is?
Yeah, what's the reaction when people say things that you made it easy when it's not true? The harder is when it seems inconsistent with the logic of the analytical judgment that has been laid out. What is our obligation? The first is to remember that they get to make the decisions, and they get to articulate if it is factually wrong, or if it misrepresents a judgment of the intelligence community. We have a responsibility to say that. Now, some of the process is built into review of speeches and the like, to minimize the likelihood of that happening. Often it happens with the off-the-cuff kind of remarks. But we have a responsibility to tell people, at a minimum, if somebody asks the community, or somebody, your tactical defeat, if somebody asks us, we're going to tell them, we don't know where you got that. That's not our judgment. And we owe it to the people to tell them what our view is. Not have them guess, but to be forward-leaning through whatever the component of the intelligence community that services them. Based in the department, their normal briefer. If it's my senior enough, pick up the phone to let them know. Again, they can do what they want, but they ought to do it knowing that if you guys come to us, we'll say, not our judgment, we'll go talk to them.
But is it incumbent upon the intelligence community to then tell the American people that something wrong?
No, I don't believe it is.
So the question for the camera was, is it incumbent upon the intelligence community to square with the American public if there's a discrepancy?
We are not the watchdog or the oversight for...
Yeah, I see all the hands, folks. Before I go to Mike Olshausen, let me piggyback on Jonathan's question. I understand there's a mechanism in the intelligence community with these NIEs to do something called a memorandum to holders, which is, you might want to describe it better, but as I understand it, it's a way to revisit the key findings of an NIE, and particularly given the importance of Iran in our national security debates today and the importance of your report, the various tones and whatnot, do you think it would be appropriate at some time to do a memorandum to holders of the report to revisit and to indicate sort of an update, if you will, of some of those key findings?
Might be. A memorandum is an art form that could be called update. That
Just want to get the terms right.
the distinction between an estimate, as we now do, the estimate, you go all the way back and you scrub all of this stuff again. An update doesn't do that. An update says that was the state of our knowledge. We have some new information or amount of time has passed. So it's, in that sense, it's not as rigorous because it isn't as all-inclusive, and it typically will address something less than the full scope of what was covered by the original estimate. For the example that you used, it may be appropriate on a piece of it to do an update. It may be appropriate, based on evidence, to redo the whole thing. We'll decide that at the time.
Okay. I'm going to please ask for brevity here, but Mike?
Yeah, I'm Mike Olshausen. I'm a former C3 analyst. You said analysts knew too little about sourcing. Is it your view that that was a result of policy, or had it evolved to be that way? Say something about the history of that.
Well, I think it had evolved in part out of the nature of information collection during the Cold War and the skill of our adversaries in this. In part, I think it had to do with you don't need to know how I do my business. Trust me, I do my job well. Some of it had to do with conditions imposed by a partner that was sharing information on it. But the part that we went after was you don't have a right to know, trust me. Is that we do trust you, but like Reagan, trust but verify on this. And that has actually turned out, after the initial shock to the system, to be a more welcome than adversarial relation. I hadn't thought about that question. Didn't know about that. We'll go back and see if we can get more on it. So it's actually turned out to be a partnership rather than a really divisive issue.
On the very back, Wayne Glass, our professor from USC, if you can use your lungs.
I'm a professor. By definition, that's what I do. Project what I have to say beyond the boundaries of acceptance. Thank you, Steve. My question is this. With the example of WMD, NIE in October of 2002, and in my capacity as an advisor to Senator Bingaman, I was concerned about the availability of that NIE to members of Congress. As I understand it, very few members of Congress actually read the document because it wasn't available readily to members or key staff, either in the Senate or the House. If the Congress is asked to vote on key policy issues, such as was the case in those days, and acting with very limited access or availability to key intelligence information, has there been anything done since that time to address this question of availability and access to members?
Great question. So the question for the internet is, for those watching on the internet, is: has anything changed regarding the availability of NIEs to members of Congress, particularly in issues of major national security decision making?
All NIEs and analytic products sent to the Congress are available to all members of Congress. Depending on the classification, in the Iraq WMD one was a highly classified product stored in the registries for each of the houses, requiring that people go there in the secure facility and read it.
Describe the register. It's actually a room.
It's a room. It's a library for classified material where people have to sign in and use it there. You can't put it in your briefcase and read it on the metro going home.
Can't take notes and stuff them in your pocket.
Well, you can take notes, but you can't take them out. No, if you need to refresh your memory, go in there. And picking up on what you said, I don't know how many read. I know, if I'm recalling correctly, Dana Priest's story in the Washington Post, in which she, if I remember, it's back a few years, she asked people in the registries how many people had read it. And since it was classified, we signed for it. And if my recollection is right, 535 members were misled by something that 6 had read. And there are 2 lessons I want to draw out of that. One is, it's incumbent on us to write, the jargon now is for maximum utility. Get it at a level of classification that makes it accessible to the people we want to read it. If that means you have to do a more highly classified annex, if that means you have to leave out certain information, so it can be on classified systems stored in something less than the registry read outside the rule. So that's incumbent on us. Sometimes you can't do it. And issues that are raised to the level of an NIE are very hard to get down to sort of a secret, simple secret level. The other is members of Congress are clearly very, very busy. They don't have a great deal of time to do this. And each one of them has to decide which issues merit them expending the time to avail themselves either with a briefing or by actually reading these products. We can't make those for them. On some of these, if I recall right, the first Iraq estimate that we did in 2007, I personally briefed 70 members of the Senate in a series of sessions, and other people briefed others. There was an interest in that product that we were summoned up.
Yes. Hi, Tom Gelton from NPR. I was intrigued by what you said, that you are right too often, and that you'd prefer to be right less often because it would mean you are asking tougher questions. But given what happens with intelligence failures, what would the consequence of being wrong more often mean for your informing policymakers? In other words, if you were to take tougher questions and be wrong more often, how would you explain those times when you're wrong to the policymakers?
Well, you explain them by what you're doing, what we're doing. That an awful lot of what we grind out is sort of routine, and I don't mean to make that sound as pejorative as it does. That, you know, an analyst has an account and they get things and they write, or they answer a question of a desk officer or somebody, and it goes into the system, and that's where most of the low-hanging fruit, the easy questions are. On the things that elevate to the NIC or NIE kind of products, they almost by definition are harder. So what I was talking about was across the community as a whole. But it's imperative, I think, in all cases for us to explain. Indeed, one of the things we're working for the transition here, for the incoming wave of officials in terms of how to understand intelligence support, is to explain very clearly what we're giving them. Confidence levels, how much confidence that they should have in it. And if, you know, if they're asking a question about describe the political party system in Ghana, okay, you know, if really one's asked that, it's not an intelligence question particularly, you know, we're going to get that one right because we can read World Fact Book or Encyclopedia. And instead of saying that's not an appropriate question, we just answer the question. But for the, you know, what will happen in Lebanon in 2009, and why will it go in that direction? Making very clear that, hey, this is, asked us a tough question.
Frank Steck from MITRE. I have a kind of process three-parter, micro, meso, and macro. Micro level, could you take apart the terms of reference questions and field them out to the professor and his graduate students across the country and just have a open source competitive version of an NIE? Mm-hmm. And then at the meso level, Brookings and AEI have done a nice bit of work on the difference between deliberative, estimative work and using decision science techniques like information markets or prediction markets. And there's some reason to believe that if you're going to collect the wisdom of the crowd or the wisdom of the community, these techniques aid to some extent the accuracy of the process. And they discuss the pros and cons of when and where you might want to do that. Is that a possibility in the context of this, which is rather unwieldy with 16 party discussions? I mean, anyway, and then at the macro level, there's a sort of feeling of the intelligence community does it and throws it over the transom, and then operations, policy, decision makers go somewhere and do something. Should there really be a process of NIE and then a net assessment with the policymakers that records how the logic of the intelligence is folded into the logic of the policy and gives a better record of how that dynamic works? So there's a three-parter for you.
Okay. Well, let me take on the, can you outsource portions? The answer is yes. Indeed, we've done this on portions, and then on one was a subject we thought we could do quite well in parallel, to see how much of this we could do by unleashing folks without clearances on unclassified information on a subject. And, mostly was parallel. It was a good reality check. I've got a questionnaire out, not on NIEs, but to analysts in our database who have subjects that are ranked in low priority and don't get the exotic collection. And the question is a very simple one. To what extent can you cover your portfolio using nothing but open source material? I don't know what the results we're still getting. On the second example here, the wisdom of crowds, one of the things that we have done is to create Intellipedia. Wikipedia on a classified system, but it's not anonymous. We want reputation to play in this. And
Something called Intellipedia?
it's something called Intellipedia.
Cool.
And it has now something on the order of 38,000 registered users. It's produced over 1 million pages and over 150,000 articles. There are living documents in there that are updated by people. The basic idea behind this is there are smart people with experience. Indeed, because of rotating around, it's almost a literally true statement that every analyst in the community is smarter about the last job that they had than the one they were in now, because they had more experience in it. We want to capture things such as a military officer who served as an attaché in Kenya and is now doing something else, but has knowledge to Kenya. And we've tried to write an estimate. That experiment didn't work, but we learned things that maybe will work.
Did you start this?
We started.
We
It was
meaning
just-
you, under your, yeah?
It was a little thing at CIA that the OD&I took over and made it part of the analytic transformation. It's been highly, highly successful. The convening people in a Delphi kind of technique, that we do a little bit of that when we convene outside experts, sometimes before, sometimes after. The difficulty here is they're only playing with a portion of the information deck, that unless you've got people with access to the same information, it's hard to do that.
Brandon Creston from AEI. I had a question more about the construction of the public version of the NIE. You mentioned that you take hundreds of pages and sometimes scale them down to just a few. Who does that scaling, and how are the decisions made about what will be cut out? Is it more or less political than how the original NIE is constructed?
Thank you for the question. That the key judgments are prepared by the intelligence community, by the NIC. It's one of the things that gets reworked by the intelligence board, and then the text made to conform to them. They are done for an informed, knowledgeable audience, and they are intended to highlight such things as what's changed in it. That's part of the logic of structuring these things, to get that up front, not build to the end of the novel with a big climax. We don't write these to become public, and indeed one of the criticisms, correct in my view, of the Iraq WMD, which did not have an unclassified version. It had a white paper, which was written in one agency, and it was depicted as if it were the unclassified version of the estimate, but it made no mention of the dissenting views, including mine, that there was no evidence of a nuclear program in Iraq. And as we came up to the sort of the rules now, we write the key judgments for the classified reader, the informed audience. If a decision is made to release an unclassified or declassified version of this, it will be as close as we can make it to the classified version. And the only changes would be deletions to protect sources and methods, or to avoid sort of what would be regarded as a gratuitous affront by naming some individuals, saying bad things about an ally of the United States. So there's a sensitivity that we take. It's not policymakers, but sort of what are we trying to do? And one of the sort of missed the point streams of criticism that the unclassified version of the Iran nuclear should have been done differently. Well, maybe, but it would have been required going back to the, we will incur the danger of spin by telling the public something different that we've told the policymakers. And we don't want to go down that road. So it is a dilemma. When you're writing for an audience that follows this day in and day out, that is looking for you to pull it together, it's very different than this is supposed to be the primer.
Before I go to Helen, a comment, I want to ask, there was a debate for a while, and it sort of disappeared, that there were certain people in government who had access to classified information, highly classified information, and that in some cases there were machines or outlets, et cetera, where they could actually see unprocessed, unpackaged intelligence, i.e. raw intelligence, and that had led to certain kinds of potential manipulation, stovepiping, et cetera. And I'm wondering whether that practice is somehow, whether it ever existed, and second, has it been dealt with in any kind of serious way to your knowledge?
Well, that the machines are the evil player in this, I don't think has been much of a problem. It will be more of a consideration because the desire is to be on the web, classified web for sure, and let people pull what they need rather than somebody selecting and pushing at them. It's actually not done very much. There's not very many policymakers that have this kind of access. The version of the malady that I think was laid here was who was making the selection of the raw stuff to show certain policymakers. And you do get in kind of a loop of a service mentality here of, I'm looking for information on X. Do you have anything more on this? So you go, if you got it, you bring it. That tends to reinforce, and it's a little more difficult to say, you asked for the stuff on X, but you really ought to know about the stuff that says not X as well, and get the raw traffic in, and sort of the attentive briefer or provider of the information should be coming back and say, we need to do an analytic product here that lays out how we evaluate the competing lines of information, what our judgment is, and get that on the record.
And is that done more systematically now?
Somewhat. I mean, we did learn a lesson out of the process. I mean, the specific criticism was on the PDB, the President's briefing, which is under me, and these standards and criteria are applied rigorously there.
Oh, I apologize. We're right at 1:30, and I promised we'd get to this last question.
Okay, Helena Carbon, I'm with the Friends Committee on National Legislation. What you've described, you said the idea is to push the envelope, and that's why it's called an estimate, but it still sounds like a very retrospective set of questions, like have they developed a WMD capacity? Well, that's obviously the big question. But what I'm not hearing is that you're actually saying, policymakers may be considering these options for the future, like, we invade Iraq or we continue with containment back in the day. So based on all of that same kind of analytical weight and evidence and use of evidence that we have developed for the NIE, we can say that if there is an invasion of Iraq, here is our estimate of what will happen, and if we continue with other options, here are some other options. I mean, I'm not hearing anything that is prospective, either back then or today. I mean, there are a lot of good prospective questions to ask today.
And prospective questions are, I mean, they weren't estimates, they were products on sort of post-invasion Iraq. They were out there. Let me pick up, since you referenced the Iran, it sounds like it's looking, the questions here was, when can they have a weapon? And so the question we addressed here had to do with timelines. How long to fizz the material? How long from acquiring fizzle material to lab work? Those were dealt with.
But can you also ask the question, what are our options?
Well, we don't do options. When it gets to the net assessment, we do not look at the United States. By law, we don't. So a net assessment has to be done by somebody else to bring in. My guess is that those who use our information are going to be less than thrilled with routine net assessments that look closely in short time frames to how they did or didn't use it. But we've just done one on a leadership change and the way we think this is going to evolve in 2 years. Has 3 broad scenarios to it with what you would look for to know whether you're on this trajectory or that trajectory, and the things of which we judge won't tell you. That it may be a big deal development, but it won't tell you which path you're on. And that kind of stuff is done probably more often than okay, let's get the big basis for the launch pad here, so people understand the basis for our projection, and more of it is just a projection.
Will that estimate be made public?
I certainly hope not.
Tom Fingar, please extend Tom Fingar our thanks. Thank you very, very much for doing this. This is a great meeting. I want to tell all of you, those of you interested, we're continuing, those of you interested in this intelligence question, we've heard from Senator Russ Feingold today, I don't know, I hope he's good to you folks, who's going to come in and talk about intelligence issues on June 23rd. And we'll also run that live on the internet too. But my personal thanks for Tom Fingar spending this time together and having such a thorough discussion on what I think is an absolutely vital issue, which is to understand process and structure behind these reports, because this is all controversial. It matters. There are people who have many different views, and this is a very diverse group, but it's very useful to have an understanding of the deeper structure of this. So thank you very, very much. Thank you.
Thank you.